All right, today we are talking about the numbers that literally shape our world. We're talking about population dynamics. These are the deep, powerful forces that decide how many of us there are on this planet, where we end up living, and really, what our future is even going to look like.
So, let's just kick things off with the biggest question of all, the one that kind of frames everything we're going to talk about. Is our world's population actually growing, or is it shrinking? Well, the short answer is, it's complicated. It's actually doing both. It just depends on where you look. And to get why, we need to pop the hood and look at the engine of population change. You know, when you really peel back all the layers, you find that every single shift in population on Earth, whether it's in a tiny town or across a whole continent, it all just boils down to a pretty simple core equation.
And here they are, the big three. You've got fertility, which is really just a fancy way of saying births. Then you have mortality, which is, you guessed it, deaths. And finally, migration, the movement of people from one place to another. That's it. Seriously. Every story about population, every headline you read is just a story about how these three things are interacting with each other.
But to really understand what's happening, we can't just count heads. Geographers and demographers have this whole toolkit of really precise ways to measure things, to decode what the numbers are actually trying to tell us. This is where we go from simple counting to some real, deep analysis.
So let's start with fertility. Instead of just counting up all the births in a year, which can be a little misleading, experts use a much sharper tool. It's called the total fertility rate, or TFR. And as you can see, what it does is it looks at the average number of kids a woman is likely to have during her childbearing years. This makes it a way, way better predictor of where a population is actually headed. And that brings us to this one single, absolutely critical number, 2.1. In the world of demography, this is the magic number. It's called the replacement level. See, if a country has a TFR of 2.1, its population is going to stay perfectly stable over time. The population is basically just replacing itself. So anything above that number means growth is coming, and anything below it, well, that signals decline.
And wow, this chart just lays out the huge differences you see across the globe. You look at sub-Saharan Africa, and the TFR is way up at 4.6. That's a recipe for massive population growth. Then you hop over to Europe, where it's 1.6. That's well below that magic replacement number. And then you have places like South Korea, with a TFR that's actually dropped below 1.0. Some people call this death spiral demographics, and it's often tied to these intense societal pressures, like super high education costs and a really demanding work culture.
Okay, so what if we want to measure that change without factoring in migration? How do we see if a population is growing or shrinking on its own? Well, for that, we use something called the rate of natural increase, or RNI. And the formula, you can see it right there, it's beautifully simple. You just take the crude birth rate and subtract the crude death rate. And they're called crude just because they look at the entire population, not one specific group. The number you get tells you if a population is naturally growing or shrinking all by itself.
And this gives us such a fascinating global picture. Much of sub-Saharan Africa has a really high positive RNI, which is what's driving that rapid growth. The United States, on the other hand, is pretty close to zero, which means without migration, the population would be pretty stable. And then you have a country like Germany with a negative RNI. That means there are actually more deaths than births, so its population would be shrinking if it weren't for immigration.
Okay, so we've got the what. We have the tools that show us if a place is growing or declining. But what about the why, right? What are the powerful forces, the social, the political, the economic things that are actually pushing these numbers up or down?
This is a great overview right here. You've got social and cultural norms, like religious beliefs or traditional views on women's roles, which have a huge impact on birth rates. Then, governments can get involved with policies to either encourage more births or maybe even limit them. Economics is massive. People tend to have fewer kids when they're worried about money, and of course, the search for a better job is one of the biggest drivers of migration. And finally, you can't forget the environment. Things like natural disasters can act as these powerful push factors that literally force people to find a new home.
So where does all this take us? This isn't just some academic exercise. Understanding these numbers, really getting them, is absolutely essential for planning our collective future. This is all about charting our demographic destiny. And here is the big so what. Why does any of this matter? Because governments depend on this data for literally everything. If you know you've got a baby boom happening, you better start planning to build more schools.
If you see you have an aging population and a low birth rate, you need to figure out how you're going to fund healthcare and pensions. It's all about putting resources where they're going to be needed most.
And if you want a really stark example of how different those needs can be, just look at this comparison. It is staggering. At its current rate of growth, Nigeria's population is expected to double in about 27 years. The United States? It would take about 233 years. I mean, just think about the difference in what's needed for infrastructure, food, jobs, and services. It's immense.
You know, this quote really just nails the whole point of this. This isn't about looking into some crystal ball and guessing the future. It's about using real, concrete data to understand where we've come from and, even more importantly, to make smart, informed predictions about what our society is going to need tomorrow.
Which brings us to one final thought to leave you with. The forces we've talked about, fertility, mortality, and migration, they're always moving, always shaping our world in ways we're just now starting to fully grasp. So the big question for all of us is, based on these numbers, what will our world's demographic destiny look like in 50 years? The answer to that is being written as we speak.